Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists and innovators that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
So the first book was an examination of how do companies manage for breakthrough innovation. And it was, long ago that we started that work. And we really took the project leader's perspective. At the same time, Clay Christensen came out with his big book, his first book on disruptive technologies. And he was basically saying large corporates can't really do it inside. They have to kind of have an arm's length approach to this. And over time, this satellite's going to take over the mothership. And we were seeing it quite differently. So we were saying, look, this can be built inside the mothership. And we had seen a couple of our companies were working at doing that.
You just heard from Gina O'Connor, professor at Babson College, where she teaches on the topics of corporate entrepreneurship and breakthrough innovation in large, mature companies. Previously, she had a long career at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She also has researched with one of our favorite thought leaders, George Day of the Wharton Business School, and has collaborated with other thought leaders that have been on this podcast. She has co-authored 3 award-winning books on breakthrough innovation and published numerous papers in leading journals, including Sloan Management Review, Harvard Business Review, RTM, and the Journal of Product Innovation Management, among others. Her mission is to help large established companies learn how to renew themselves through organic growth via game-changing strategic innovation. She is a firm believer that to be successful, organizations must develop an innovation function complete with its own people, processes, metrics, and culture that operate within the company to translate emerging science, technology, and business models into new platforms of growth that will fuel the company's future health in spite of itself. In this discussion, we fashion our conversation by following her fascinating journey through 3 distinct phases of studies as she unpacked this exploration over years of research, the foundation of her books that evolved as her research revealed new findings. Our conversation covers more than we can summarize in a short introduction, but among these insights, we discuss what her team's research discovered are the true constraints to innovation. And contrary to what many people think, they go often beyond just the technical. The 3 distinct competencies of innovation: discovery, incubation, and scaling that businesses must develop, each with different people, processes, and metrics. The concept of domains of innovation intent, as she calls them, untap new markets in which a company can explore and potentially unlock a wide portfolio of opportunities. The key learnings leaders should take away from her team's extensive studies to tackle an often overlooked component of innovation, talent management. Ladies and gentlemen, Gina O'Connor. Gina, thank you so much for being here with us. We have been hoping to get you on the podcast for a while. I know you've been very, very, very busy teaching, and now we're getting you at a moment where you can stop and share a little bit with us. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah.
So there's so much that you have worked on in this area of institutionalizing innovation, enabling large organizations to innovate. You have 3 books and numerous articles. The one that our audience will be most familiar with is Grabbing Lightning from 2008. But maybe you could just sort of describe these 3 books and sort of what the key takeaway is of the 3, how they build on each other, just for us to orient ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the first book was an examination of how do companies manage for breakthrough innovation. And it was, long ago that we started that work. And we really took the project leader's perspective. And so companies volunteered projects that they believed had the potential to be breakthroughs, game changers in their industry. And we got to know the leaders of those projects as the projects were moving forward or not, in their organizations. And we were able to track with the project leaders and their teams for 5 years. We interviewed them. So we really, got a sense of the experience that they had and sort of, fighting against the traditional norms in organizations and all the kinds of bumps in the road that they had and the commercial and the successes that they had. And that really kind of allowed us to formulate a little bit of a hypothesis about how organizations might be able to do this better. And, we started to realize, as everybody, I'm sure the listeners here know, you need to be able to support these things in a different way because they're navigating, uncharted territory, not only in the market, but in the technology space, in the science and technology space, and particularly inside the company. And so that was where we kind of identified that although R&D people will say that, this breakthrough innovation space is really characterized by market uncertainty and technical uncertainty, we found these two other categories of uncertainty that really challenged these project managers, and they weren't being surfaced and handled. And that was resource uncertainty, which is, of course, the waxing and waning of budgets, across multi-year funding requirements. But almost more importantly was the issue of competency gaps inside the company. And so an ability and a willingness to partner and a skill set to partner it with the learning-based partnerships, the different types of partnerships that I would say today we've become much more sophisticated about. But the fourth category was organizational uncertainty. So strong commitment and then pullbacks from business units around commitment to receiving a particular breakthrough innovation and scaling it. All different kinds of passive sorts of resistance because, some of these things will threaten current businesses. And a lot around senior leadership's commitment, given that, the environment is constantly changing, external forces and internal dynamics. And so it's really that organizational uncertainty that I would say lengthens the life cycle, the development path of breakthroughs in large corporates much longer than probably needs to be from the perspective of the other three categories of uncertainty. All right. So that was kind of it about phase one. And we started to draw some conclusions. At the same time, Clay Christensen came out with his big book, his first book on disruptive technologies. And he was basically saying large corporates can't really do it inside. They have to kind of have an arm's length approach to this. And over time, this satellite's going to, take over the mothership. And we were seeing it quite differently. And so we were saying, look, this can be built inside the mothership. And we had seen a couple of our companies were working at doing that. So that is what caused us to do the second phase.
Yeah, I know. I love that. I believe just philosophically, and that's what I love about your work, you prove what I want to believe, that Christensen and others are describing a problem that some have solved and can be solved, not an innate, permanent kind of state or something like that, right? Disruption is something we can understand and recognize and design for.
And I think, our lens was different from his. Our lens was all around the health of the mothership organization, ongoing renewal. And I find so many other kind of scholars, but also practitioners that get involved in corporate venture capital funding and other types of arrangements are more focused on the health of the ventures as opposed to the consequence on the organization's renewal. So ours is all about how do organizations constantly renew themselves through innovation.
Yes, right. That's right. And then sometimes investors, there's some investors I like reading about, and they're sort of like even easier to abandon, right? Because you can say, oh, we'll just sell the company. It shouldn't exist anymore. And I get it. We committed to the longevity and the role of the incumbent. So then let's go.
Well, we can go and face the second book, but first I want to just comment on this, that at one company commissioned a little study from me, not my own research. Well, some of it's my own, but what do we know about the financial consequences of investing in doing this from an internal perspective? And I pulled together, essentially, it was like 9 empirical academic studies, large sample studies, along with what McKinsey and BCG are saying from their benchmarking data, and then a number of case studies, and have really been able to come up with some data, significant data from unbiased, researchers using like panel data, large empirical data sets that show the increase in firm market value, stock price, capitalization associated with investments in beyond incremental innovation. So the data exists. And there's even studies out there that talk about how to talk to market analysts about what you're doing as it's going forward. So it's important for leaders to realize this, I think. And, I don't think that translation has really occurred out of that, empirical research that's very tedious. So
I think, yeah, I want to get to the second book, but I also want to emphasize as well, I think that a big part of, and you point about this, especially when you talk about resource allocation and where resources come from, a big part of a big piece of the strategic puzzle is investor relations and getting the right investors and communicating and managing them. Okay, maybe we'll have time to get into that. So next we go to capabilities. Right?
Understanding that, we had arrived at this hypothesis that because we'd seen a couple of attempts inside companies to build this as a capability, not just, so we were following like a glamour project, if you will, inside these companies, but several of them had an intent to actually build a whole capability around this. So that led to the second study. And it was, how are you actually doing this? Because we had formed our own opinion about how you'd have a team, where it would report, what it would do. Anyway, so that second study we followed, again, there were 12 companies that volunteered into that study. And we worked in partnership with the Industrial Research Institute. That's an organization of R&D directors and leaders, CTOs. And also, they're now named the Innovation Research Interchange. So it's the same acronym, but, anyway, they've kind of upped their game on their name. At any rate, so these were companies that had a declared intent to evolve a capability for sort of more breakthrough innovation. And then I started getting phone calls from companies that weren't even part of the IRI that had heard about the study. And so we had a second set of companies that were about 9. So overall, it was, 20-something companies participating in this. We interviewed the first cohort every 6 months to understand what was changing. So they had an identified team associated with, well, some of them did, but they had certainly the declared intent to evolve this capability. So we were watching what was the mandate of that group, and we interviewed the person who was most responsible for that mandate, those to whom that one reported, and the people that reported to that person. Every 6 months we did that. And it was all about how many people are on the team at this point? Where are you reporting to? What does your portfolio look like? How are you measuring your progress? How far along are you keeping the projects until you transition them into an operating unit? All of these, what are your metrics? How are you being resourced? So all of these elements of a traditional management system, how is that being designed and, monitored to succeed? And so I would say we learned the most in that phase of the research. And that's the one you've kind of picked up on. That resulted in the second book, the Grabbing Lightning book. And from there, one of the major insights was it's not just a capability for breakthrough or strategic innovation. It really fell out into these 3 kind of competency areas: discovery and incubation and acceleration, which is really the scaling. And so many of us now have similar terminology, but many people think of those as 3 phases of a process. But really, the management system elements have to be designed specifically for each of those because they're very different competencies. And each one of them operates like a portfolio. So it's not like you have one project, one idea, and it goes from discovery to incubation to acceleration. There's processes for discovery, and there's processes for incubation, and there's processes for the scaling. And think about the management system, like you don't have the same metrics for discovery as you do for scaling. And certainly you don't have the same kind of people, even though that was the promise that was given to most people. If you come up with a great idea, hey, and you grow it, you can be the general manager of that business. And we found it just doesn't work. And frankly, most people don't want that, so we started to see these differences in the the nature of the skills, et cetera.
So are you saying that some of the skills, or I can see some competencies don't translate to the other, so that they're different competencies? Are there conflicting or competencies that can't exist together between the three?
Well, from a individual skill set, yeah, there really are. I mean, the discovery and incubation competencies are closer in relationship to any of the other two, combinations. So we coined this term dincubation in case you're just starting out and you can't fully, I staff this thing with these very clear, specific skills. But that's getting ahead of the game. This concept of discovery and incubation and acceleration was kind of an interesting insight, because we would find the way we kind of came to this was as these companies had their team, the team viewed its mandate, the team's views of its mandate evolved over the 5 years that we tracked with them. And why? It's because, they were releasing the project opportunities into the business unit too soon. Every single time their budgets would expand, their staff would expand, and they would hold the opportunities longer. And we're like, why? Well, we send it to the business unit and it gets starved for resources. There is still too much uncertainty. And this is causing all these political, issues of, sort of the blame game. But in actual fact, a business unit is responsible for bottom line, top line growth, but bottom line margin. And the place where breakthrough innovation requires the most investment is in the scaling. Discovery is cheap. I'm telling you, it is inexpensive. And incubation is not that expensive. It's much more expensive to not do incubation.
It's much more expensive to not do incubation. It sounds like you've thought about that sentence before. Could you unpack that for us?
So there's two reasons. One is a lot of times they'll come up with a great idea. They'll have an idea jam or a contest or, something, and we'll come up with a great idea and they'll want to down select to the one that looks the most obvious, the clearest path. The likelihood of a kill on that is extremely high, And so what we want to do is generate a lot of opportunities within a space, a problem opportunity space in discovery, and then bring all of them into incubation and start to work them simultaneously, because we find some of them merge. It becomes a much more strategic play if you play it like a portfolio. It becomes a whole family of opportunities, a whole business, right? And we tend to sub-optimize those opportunities if we don't engage in incubation. Yeah. So, yeah. And so I think I could mention DSM was a company that we were noticing. They actually weren't part of that study, but we became aware of them during that phase. And they had built this innovation center where they actually kept the opportunities all the way through scaling. And so that was probably the most extreme example of this that we saw, but very successful. DSM has 100% renewed itself through its innovation function. 100%.
Can you just describe DSM, the business?
Yeah, so it's in the Netherlands. It's a Dutch. It stands for Dutch State Mines. They were a mining company 150 years ago. Today they're a bio-based company. They have evolved several times, but there was a chief innovation officer, Rob Van Leen was his name. He came up on our radar and we got a hold of him and got a chance to start to interview him even before I met him, before we even started the third phase of the research, which is where we really dug into them. But they had formulated this concept that they called emerging business areas. It's what I now call domains of innovation intent. So they're kind of like big problem opportunity spaces that the company commits to. They're future focused. And when we started tracking with them, they had 5 EBAs that they were working on in their innovation center. And today, one of them turned out, to not be strategically relevant after a while because of all the pivots that occurred. Another turned out to be more incremental than they expected. So they sort of fast-tracked it into a line of business. And then through a CEO change, there was a slight change in their strategy. And so they sold one, their advanced solar EBA. And now they've sold off their other operations. And the two remaining ones have become basically their mainstream businesses. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these capabilities that allow us to do all three things. And then with your third book, what is that next order problem that you address with Beyond the Champion?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Each phase of this research was triggered by what's the barrier that we're observing, what's the barrier to success that we observed in the previous phase? So of all of the elements of the management system to support the new stream activity in comparison to the mainstream activity, that's kind of how I think about this now. The single biggest surprise to us, it wasn't metrics, it wasn't resourcing, it was talent management. And to make a distinction here, it was not about the technical community, the R&D people. It was about what we'll call the new business creation people. And so there was more around punishment in their career paths than there was about rewards. And so, these are people that you might consider champions or entrepreneurial types, but a lot of what we started with was from R&D or a corporate venture capital arm. And we'd start talking with these people and we would say, who are you depending on to help you move this forward? Who else are you helping? And then we'd ask them, who are you helping to move this forward? And so there'd be people who kind of volunteered to partner with the inventors, if you will, or the technical community, or the CVC scouts generally, many of them have PhDs in technical areas. And so these are people that are much more like new business creation type people. And I draw a distinction between entrepreneurs or even intrapreneurs and new business creation people. These people have such pride of belonging to these companies, these brand power companies. They take great pride in realizing that there are so many knowledge-based resources inside their company. I've got many quotes that say, I can pick up the phone, I can call whoever I want, in this organization and get an answer. And so the power of internal informal networks is highly correlated with strategic innovation success in studies that we've done. Okay, but the point here is, there's a lot of kind of sad stories about people who did, partner up to help create these opportunities to do the incubation kind of work, if you will, where if any particular opportunity hit a wall, so did they from a career standpoint. They'd be put in the redeployment pool. We talked with people who came in with a cohort of MBAs, they were Harvard MBA people, and this guy went to the innovation side and this guy went to an operational role. And the career path upward was very uneven.
Yes, I got you. Because the failure rate of these innovations is much, much higher.
Yeah, or the learning rate.
Yeah, and the learning rate, yes.
But the other thing is that incubation can take quite a long time. And so if, you've got to pass certain milestones to get to for not just first revenues, but like a path to profitability, this could be a 5 to 10 year window and everybody else is getting promoted every other year, essentially.
So I want to correct what I said. I just want to point out, you just corrected me. Took me a little while to get that correction. I said the failure rate and you said the learning rate. And what you're saying is viewing the failure as a learning opportunity as opposed to defining it as a failure. Is that what you're pointing to? Gotcha.
Exactly. And that's what having this domain of innovation intent allows us to do. What our attempt to do is to put a stake in the ground in that big problem opportunity space. We just don't know how it's going to play out yet. So you try this thing, and in a traditional, stage gate process or whatever, that each of those would be called a failure. But this is determining the strategy or play strategy in this big problem space.
So I'm going to say it in my own words. So we're taking all of these different experiments or trials, and we're putting them all grouping together, and we're calling this a domain of innovation intent. And it's like investing in a stock. If we invest in a diversified portfolio, that portfolio may be successful, even if the individual investments aren't all successful.
Right. So you think about a huge, opportunity space that's kind of future forward, and you think about all the ways our organization could play in that space. And there are many. We worked with Grundfos, for example. That was a Danish company. They make water pumps. And so they went through an exercise of creating these domains of innovation intent. And, they're very compelling and energizing statements and really kind of narratives. And they even turned each of theirs into sort of a cartoon graphics that just causes you to spark your creative juices. And so one was decentralizing water treatment, for example. Yeah. Another was future homes and living in China, which by that they meant like densely populated urban areas. And the third was zero impact commercial buildings. Those were the titles, but you can imagine the narratives and how a company whose job is to move water around can start to think about all the ways they could. So each one of those just opens up the creativity. And all of those become opportunities that you kind of chart in discovery. And then in incubation, you got to start trying them out and testing them out. And eventually a strategy for this business emerges.
And I love it's very much an outside in versus inside out, as our friend George Day advocates for. And I also see that it opens up a kind of a perspective of sort of like ecosystem or market or collaboration, as opposed to pushing this device into homes, right?
Completely. And exactly. And that goes back to what I said about resource as one of the main categories of uncertainty. So now you've got to reach out with partners that you've never had a relationship with before and develop a trusting relationship for how we're going to learn together and create this market space together.
Yes. So you've talked about, written about this market space and creating the market space, and that companies often underinvest in developing that market space. How's that playing out now?
Well, it's still happening. And I think primarily because many of these, quote, breakthroughs start in the technical community, And so what we find is that companies spend a lot more attention on developing a technology, as you said. But what we also have to create is a market, all the infrastructure for the market, the ecosystem for the market. Who's going to do what as far as degrees of freedom on a business model in a value chain? That all has to get negotiated. You've got a lot of degrees of freedom as far as that goes. So, for example, as we were talking earlier, I'm working with a company now that believes they do have a technical breakthrough on how we move to direct current and make it safe and usable and sustainable from alternating current. So it's a huge play in the energy market that will be around sustainability, around cost, around, and mostly and around safety. And so they've come up with this, or that has been invented, and they're wondering why, sales aren't taking off. Well, there's just so much that has to get done to remove the fear of the threat to the current players in the value chain, and to make it worth their while to be willing to switch. And in some cases, it'll never be worth their while. And so you're going to have to replace some of these. Well, this takes as much money, investment of resources, as the technical development does. And in fact, I've seen in other instances, like at Texas Instruments or at Analog Devices, some of the projects that we followed, it can take more money than the technical development. And it's not just the money, it's the skill sets and the competences in incubation and acceleration to do that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Going back to the mindsets and capabilities and perspectives, I think that's got to be very different, right? Like we just had on the podcast a professor from Harvard and someone from Blue Origin talking about the emergence of the space industry and kind of liking it to the emergence of the internet industry or the automobile industry. And so at the beginning, you have maybe one very expensive point solution, but then you need people to build the roads, build the charging stations, build all the infrastructure, create interoperability. It's a very different way to think of innovating.
Well, but it's true. So, and in those two cases that you're mentioning, you started out de novo, like there wasn't anything to replace. Now, in a lot of these cases, I guess this is disruption and we're on the offense we're creating this, but the benefit to society is enormous. And
yeah, Machiavelli said the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old model and lukewarm defenders and those who may do well under the new. And that creates this. So have you looked at that? What's your advice for overcoming that natural kind of protective barrier? Is it disruption again?
Well, in those cases, you are the disruptor, right? I mean, we need to be humane about it. This is why I say, this future forward conversation. I've worked with companies who have gone through an exercise with me with creating these domains of innovation intent, and then some of them don't want to tell anybody. We need to tell people. We need to talk about the future. And this is again why the bigger, well-known, mature companies can really, lead the way on some of this. And so it gives people time to adjust and time to start to figure out how I'm going to operate under the new model.
How I can thrive under the new model.
Exactly. And there are companies that do very, very well in terms of kind of taking care of their people in this. And even today, I mean, I'm not a huge advocate of everybody like moving jobs every 6 months, but the market for employment is a lot more fluid than it used to be. We're not looking up classified ads in the newspaper any longer. There's all kinds of approaches to a more fluid.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question on that. This is a little bit self-serving because we're going to get to be with you in New York in a few months from the time of this recording. And also we're going to be with a firm called Heidrick & Struggles, which is a talent firm. And what they're going to be talking about is sort of the agility of talent and the flexibility of talent. Can you unpack that for a little bit for us? Why are these two things dependent on each other? Yeah.
Well, this idea of upskilling and reskilling, obviously it's becoming increasingly important just from a disruption point of view. And I don't know the extent to which companies feel a responsibility for that, but I do know several who do undertake a responsibility. And some of them are family-run businesses and a little bit more of a patriarchal or matriarchal culture, if you will, who are getting very engaged in the local communities. And when there's going to be a reskilling or outskilling, they start working with the local communities and help create those connections. Starbucks was at one point really famous for doing this, saying to their folks, we don't expect you to be here any more than 2 years. So, get yourself trained up and these sorts of things. So I think, that's a really important aspect right now within, and maybe you don't want to go in this direction with this, but within strategic innovation, we find the opposite. We find that individuals are expected to do the whole thing, and it's almost on a volunteer basis. And I'm, again, talking about the new business creation kind of person. But the recognition that, these skill sets are different and people get stalled in a career path is also not good. And our statistics, our data show that when people leave an innovation function in a company, in some cases, they go back out into a mainstream, business unit, but they don't do very well under those circumstances. And in the cases where they leave the company, almost 90% of them end up working in another company in their innovation function. So it's extremely important that we try to recognize that this talent is important talent for us. And how do we kind of, select, develop, and retain these people. Because it's, right now they're kind of a rare bird. I don't think they will be once we really start to diffuse this concept that, you can have discovery people and incubation people.
Great. As opposed to water pump people and engine people. I gotcha.
Exactly.
Got it.
We've seen people, and you probably have too, in the work that you come across a lot of people in this area. They're fungible across like technology spaces or market space. They learn and can absorb these things very quickly. What they're very good at doing, like in the discovery types, are at spotting different opportunities and thinking current and thinking future at the same time. It's incredible. And incubation people are just very good at designing really clever tests to learn the most for the least amount of sunk cost. Incredible. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And I could see how that also points to a different way of thinking of certainly career paths, but also what a role is, or what an expertise is, or what do you learn, like, a curriculum in schools. Excellent. I love is you have such well thought through kind of frameworks that point to a whole myriad of changes that need to be made. And it's probably going to be at the top that you can make these changes, right? Because you can see how the pieces of the system kind of interact. So talk to the leader. What does the leader need to think about or do, or maybe who's leader need to be in order to effectuate this change?
Well, thanks. I think that's a really important question. One thing that we've kind of noticed is, well, most people who are in top leadership roles in large corporates today have succeeded in their careers through the world of operational excellence, in the mainstream. And so we're kind of a generation or two removed yet from people who have really experienced what we're talking about today, because our companies haven't had the staying power for new ventures groups or, any of this. We're just, we know a lot more today than we did even 20 years ago. But in terms of actual practice, we're still, I think, experimenting a lot. So there's a challenge when you try to put together a leadership council, I'll call it an innovation council, to who what we need them to do is to think new streams of growth. And that means thinking future, and that means thinking possibility, where typically our leaders think about probability and risk, And so it's all around risk mitigation as opposed to opportunity. And in our brains, we train our brains to be more, deductive in our reasoning, quick decision-making, and those sorts of things. And so this is kind of the next frontier for where we're going, which is how do we start to help leadership teams or a subset of the leadership team come to grips with this concept of domains of innovation intent and how you might formulate them for your organization when it really kind of takes a different type of thinking. And then how does that team who know one another very well, they are generally, coming up through their organization, they've known one another and they have a dynamic between them, among them, how do they need to behave in the world of the creation of the new streams with one another, but also then with the teams that are bringing forward the learnings from within each domain of innovation intent? And I find that it's a really different dynamic. And so I think there's some, I don't know what you would call it, but learning or kind of reframing and exercising a part of our brain that we're not used to exercising at the leadership level. But it's so important because we can create all kinds of programs and hackathons and contests and try to, get ideas from the bottom up. But I found after 25 years of watching this, breakthroughs don't happen. The seed of it can happen, but unless you've got leadership support and like evangelization around this, you're not going to get the commercial fruits of this.
Gotcha. Yes. Lovely. I mean, we could spend more time. We're reaching the top of our time with you. I love how many times in this conversation you said this thing that we call it, this thing that. I believe that when you don't have a name for something, then you are having a conversation kind of on the edge of language. It's not yet named. And that's really what I get a lot out of your work, that you are in that discovery phase at that very front end, that fuzzy front end. And so thank you for doing that work for us and helping us reach some clarity. People who want to continue learning from you and following you on the edge of this pursuit of this thing, how can they continue to stay in touch with you? Certainly, we're going to recommend that they buy all of your books, and then you're a prolific writer as well.
If you have insomnia, that's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of detail in the books.
Yeah.
Yeah, just LinkedIn is the best way
to
get in touch, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Well,
Gina, I know this was shorter than it deserved, but thank you so much for sitting down with us and unpacking your work and your future work with us. And I can see profound implications for organizations and workers and society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you to our guest, Gina O'Connor. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, our editor, and the rest of our team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Outthinkers.